I think when you ask about the church and homosexual life and practice, I think more than anything else it has to do with the local situation. And my paper was really addressing, I didn't say it so explicitly, but it was addressing the idea, ultimately it's going to be decided at the local church. Ultimately it has to work at the local church level. And among the principles that I've addressed are the recognition that the gospel calls us to put Jesus Christ first in our lives. And so whatever a person may be sexually, putting Jesus Christ first in one's life is the crucial element. And you can't determine that in a person's life by an edict from the General Conference, for example. Ultimately, whether or not an individual is in Christ is a judgment that can only be made in a local setting from people who are engaged with the person. And so the challenge of the homosexual developments in understanding in recent times is exactly how that impacts the way people function in the local church. At times in the past, people were content with silence, for example. Homosexuals shouldn't talk about it. If they have an orientation, don't talk about it, don't practice it, don't discuss it. Today that's gone. My children grew up in an Adventist academy and grade schools, and they knew from age 10 and 12 who was gay and who was not. Very different than the world I grew up in. And so we're struggling to understand biblically how we respond to that type of a situation. So the core principle is that at creation there is an ideal. But I think the reality today is that the world is broken. We are broken. And we are broken in many different ways. I think one of the positives about the whole awareness of homosexuality is it's forcing us to think more deeply about a lot of things and recognizing that homosexual people are broken, heterosexual people are broken. We have urges, we have desires, we struggle with many things. And I think at times we don't talk about it. And this is sort of forcing us to talk about it. And it shouldn't simply be homosexual people that have to talk about it, but to be more open and honest about our own struggles and our own challenges can be a healthy outcome. Churches that actually address the real struggles of people. Silence has not been a blessing to us. And so I think recognizing the principle of what is God's ideal, but also recognizing that we live in a real world, a broken world, and in a broken world, compassion is needed, understanding is needed, authenticity is needed. Yes, I've attempted to draw a distinction based on some solid psychological work that there's a distinction between a gay identity and a homosexual orientation. In a sense, the one may build on the other. A person who recognizes that they have an orientation to homosexual attractions may in the end come to embrace that as the core of who they are and draw the conclusion that if I'm going to be a whole person, I need to be able to practice who I am. Obviously, such an identity assertion is challenging from the biblical perspective and also from the Adventist perspective because such an assertion would privilege that even above identity in Christ. And so if one's identity in Christ, you cannot have two masters, and that becomes a challenge. On the other hand, homosexual orientation involves a much larger group. There are a lot of people with a homosexual orientation that do not embrace it, that wish it was not so, that pray that God will remove it from them. And yet research suggests that very, very few, if any, ever are able to change from that. So recognizing that people may have a homosexual orientation, what the church should ask is not that they change that which they cannot change, but rather ask that they not embrace it as their core identity, but rather see their identity in Christ, and then to follow Christ's guidelines for pursuing that identity. Just as the church does not encourage or in any way even allow promiscuity in the heterosexual variety, so the call to identity in Christ would be a call to as needed celibacy, for example. That is the million-dollar question. How do you determine that someone's identity is in Christ? And I think obviously through the years the church has sought to make that judgment based on outward behaviors. But the outward behaviors are only a symptom of the reality that is inside. And so they are somewhat imprecise. And that again comes back to the idea that these issues ultimately can be settled only at the local church because it's case by case, on an individual basis. Heterosexual people, homosexual people all struggle to identify with Christ, struggle with urges that they don't consider appropriate and how one should respond to them, thoughts that may come at random. People struggle with these things. And how we work that out is something best considered only in the local church, where people know each other, where they are open, honest, authentic with each other. Then we can make wise decisions in terms of where a person stands with Christ and how, to what degree leadership becomes possible and so forth. I've noticed, for example, that if a single pastor is presumed to be heterosexual, it doesn't bother us a great deal. You know, we might say, hey, you know, when are you going to get married, or when, you know, you got anybody? You know, we may say that, but it's okay. And we basically trust them. But the moment a person admits that they have a homosexual orientation, a certain distance tends to come in. And I think that's what people might call discrimination. That's a challenge because it requires us perhaps to rethink the way that we treat people and who we trust in ministry and so forth. So I think that we are probably learning our way into this issue. We've been forced to it by recent events in government, courts, etc. And I believe that God can use this conversation to help us to have a clearer understanding of what it means to be in Christ, a clearer understanding of how a church community can be healthy and live together as an extended family.